The officer's laugh cut through the air, sharp and careless, as the woman stood frozen in disbelief. "Look at her face," another whispered, not knowing the body camera was still on. What began as a cruel joke would soon unravel lives and careers. She swallowed her anger, her silence heavier than any outburst. No one in that room knew she held the power to end their charade. Because the woman they mocked was not just anyone, she was a federal judge. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you. I don't want to miss it. Rain slid down the courthouse windows like quiet accusations. The city had folded into itself. Wet streets, neon reflections, the low hum of a highway far below. Inside, the marble smelled faintly of lemon and old decisions. Light from a single lamp pooled on the bench where Evelyn Carter sat, fingers laced tight, as if holding a rosary she had no time for. She watched her reflection in the dark glass of the courtroom doors, a woman in a navy suit, hair pinned back, the crease of worry near her left eye. The reflection looked older than she felt, and for a moment, she could not tell if the tiredness belonged to the night or to years of bearing other people's truths. Evelyn had been a judge long enough for her name to be familiar to the city's commerce and strain. People said her voice sounded like judgment. Firm, patient, careful. But tonight, her voice felt small to her own ears. The case files stacked at her side were a small mountain of paper. Someone else's crimes, someone else's grief. She had come to court to do a simple thing: sign an order, close a chapter, and found herself battling a different restlessness. In the long silence between dockets, memories floated up like the scent of rain on hot asphalt. She remembered being younger, a lawyer with hands that did not tremble, speaking in rooms where her single name was a surprise and then a quieting force. She remembered nights after trials when she would walk to the river and watch the city's lights ripple like questions. She had learned to ask the right kinds of questions. Who bears the cost? Who is allowed the kindness of being believed? Those questions had guided her robe and her choices. Tonight, they settled like a stone in her chest. A janitor pushed a cart down the corridor, and his radio whispered an old gospel on the edge of hearing. The sound threaded through the hush and seemed to find Evelyn, not the judge, but the person beneath. A woman who had once learned to read a room and then read it again in case she had been blind at first. In the distance, a siren rose and then fell like a tide. The city breathed around her, restless and indifferent. She stood when her name was called. Her footsteps were precise, the way she moved when she wanted to be both present and invisible. The magistrate's light above flickered as if wondering at the late hour. She signed, her pen scraping like a small confession. Outside, a patrol car idled long enough to make the rain tremble against the windshield. Evelyn watched it through the glass, an animal alert to distant shadow. There was nothing to say, yet everything felt unsaid. A clerk greeted her, eyes bright with small kindness. "Safe trip home, Judge Carter," he said, and the words landed like a hand on a shoulder she did not always allow. She smiled, a careful thing. "Thank you, Mark," she said. For a second the world seemed to balance, a perfect, fragile scale. She had been raised on short prayers and longer sacrifices. Her mother taught her to iron collars until they shone, because someone's first impression could change the arc of a life. Her father taught her the names of streets and the taste of stubbornness. Those lessons lived underneath her robes. Polish, practice, endurance. There was a photograph tucked into her docket, folded at the corner. It showed her at a small table in a kitchen that no longer belonged to her, an old apartment with sunlight slanting through blinds. A younger man smiled beside her, his arm around her shoulder in a way that still made her chest ache. His name was Daniel. He had been her first real love and her first real loss. The photograph was a relic of a time when promises felt like things that could be kept. The promise had broken, as promises sometimes do, and the sharp pieces had cut into her life in ways she was still learning to dress. On the tram-led street outside, voices rose and fell. A vendor called the days last specials. Shoes clicked. The city moved like a great machine, efficient, loud, unconcerned with the small human heartbreaks that spun inside it. Evelyn walked through that current with the kind of concentration that made her seem part of the machine and not at all a passenger. People glanced, some with reverence, some with curiosity. She was used to that, to being watched, to being judged. She had learned to keep her face neutral the way a sailor keeps a steady hand on a wheel. Halfway down the block, a group of officers stood under a building's awning, their coats still wet with rain. They laughed in small bursts, the kind of laughing that felt like a shield rather than joy. One of them nudged another, pointing at a stray dog that shook itself and scattered droplets like a shower. They did not notice when Evelyn passed. She tried not to notice them either, but something in the way they watched the street made her slow. It was not curiosity that made her stop. It was the memory of younger days when a different kind of watch had followed her. Eyes that assumed she would stumble, voices that assumed she would be less. She remembered an afternoon when she had stepped into a convenience store and a man had spoken to her the way someone speaks to a stranger who does not belong. His voice had carried the weight of centuries. That day she had answered with legal precision and calm anger. She had let him say his piece, and then she had spoken hers, insisting upon dignity. She had learned to keep her reactions measured because measured responses had power. Measured responses became rules of engagement in a world that often wanted to reduce people to single notes. A small child dashed past, squealing with something like danger behind his grin. He slid past the officers and glanced up. His eyes found Evelyn's face and lingered as if searching for a tail. For a second, she could imagine what the child's life might be: loud, certain, unafraid. She envied that certainty. It was an ache like hunger. At home later, her apartment smelled of coffee and the faint perfume of the city. She made herself a cup and watched steam lift like a small promise. The radio in the kitchen spoke of the evening's news: a political scandal, a council meeting, an accident downriver. Nothing that felt, at first, like it might undo the careful construction of her life. She sat at the table and opened the folded photograph, tracing the outline of Daniel's smile. There was a note on the back in a hand she recognized. "Let me keep the light for you," it read, in handwriting that had seemed certain once. She folded the picture carefully, sliding it into a drawer she kept for small things that were not quite finished. She slept later with a thin blanket and a mind full of small reckonings. Dreams hovered, fragmented. A courtroom where the benches were full of faces she could not name, a judge's gavel that turned to ash in her hand. She woke to the sound of a text message, a single line that made the small inside world pulse. "Watch the news this morning. There's something about the precinct." The message was from Sarah, a friend from law school, whose voice had always matched Evelyn's in quick sympathy and bracing honesty. Evelyn blinked at the screen, then poured coffee, then dressed with the deliberate motions of someone who had learned ritual was the only defense against surprise. There was a quiet in her moves, and in that quiet a note of readiness, not for any open battle, but for the small war of living honestly in a world that sometimes refused to see. She had spent a life making laws and making sense of other people's wounds. Tonight the city felt like a drumbeat, a warning, a call, a promise that something reshaping was coming. She did not know its shape. She only knew the pressure of it, a weather front waiting to break. The narrator watched her then from two angles, with a tenderness that could name her wounds, and with an impartial eye that noticed details: the knuckle of her thumb a little white from gripping the mug, the faint scuff on her heel, where she had once run for a bus and missed it, the way her nameplate on the bench had a small chip on one corner. Both voices agreed on this. Evelyn Carter would be forced, sooner or later, to reconcile what she knew in law with what she knew in the marrow of herself. The city would not wait politely for her to prepare. Outside the window, the rain began again, softer this time, as if the night wanted to hush the world to sleep before it moved. Evelyn set her cup down and watched the pattern the droplets made on the glass, thinking of the small stones we drop into still water and the rings that never stop widening. ChatGPT said Evelyn had meant only to walk. The city felt too loud inside her head, a reel of cases and faces that would not stop. She left her apartment before noon. Rain gone, but the pavement was still silver, the air sharp and honest. The sun pushed through the clouds in thin, careful strips that made the wet asphalt glitter. She moved without a plan, letting her feet choose the streets, the way someone who wants to be anonymous moves through a crowd. Half a block from the coffee shop she usually avoided on busy mornings, two patrol cars sat under the shadow of an overpass, lights off, the men inside talking low, as if they were trying to keep some important thing private. Evelyn did not think much of them at first. She was used to police presence. Then, one of the officers rose and stepped onto the sidewalk. He was broad-shouldered, his uniform pressed, his badge catching the light, like a promise. The other officer looked smaller, wiry, his jaw set the way a man's jaw sets when he waits for a cue. They saw her before she saw their look. A small shift in the air told her. The casual observation, the tilt of a head that meant the world had already put her into a box. She walked with the same steady gait she used in court, but her body tightened. A mother's instinct, a lawyer's training, a life threaded with careful measures, all of it folded into the moment and tightened her. She kept her face neutral. "Hey," the larger officer called, not a question but a direction. Evelyn paused. She had learned that consent is often a polite fiction on the streets. She had learned to choose where she gave it. "Ma'am, you got a minute?" She considered telling them she was late, that she had to cross the bridge, that the city had work for her. Instead, she nodded. Her voice was the voice that had carried sentences and verdicts and the weight of statutes. Yes, they asked where she was going, and Evelyn answered briefly. The smaller officer made a half laugh, the sound meant to make the air lighter, like all the cogs in the world still turned the way they should. Then the large officer stepped closer than protocol required and said something that was meant to be a joke and landed like a stone. It was the kind of sentence that assumed things, that measured people against a single scale and declared them wanting. Evelyn felt the blood rise under her skin. There was a moment where she could have shown her badge, put on the robe of authority like some shield. She could have said, loudly and carefully, that she was a judge, but she did not. Something in her held back. Pride, perhaps, or the quiet knowledge that being known can change everything in the wrong direction. Instead, she answered with a soft, precise correction that made the man chuckle and then lean in, as if she had offered him a puzzle he might solve. The smaller officer reached for a thermos and took a long drink. He made a face of mock pity, then mimed offering her a cup, his eyes flicking over her suit as if inspecting merchandise. "You lawyers always look like you lost something," he said, and the laugh he expected did not come for her. It came instead from a stranger passing by, a bark of amusement that made the officers grin like children sharing a secret. Evelyn kept herself measured. Her hands, for once, did not twist into a pen or a tissue or the usual props that steadied her. When the larger officer called someone on his radio, it felt like a test, one man calling the world to witness. She saw, in the corner of his mouth, the small curl of someone who was enjoying a private victory. The city moved on around them like a stream that had no patience for small cruelties. People walked by with earbuds, with groceries, with their own urgent dramas. Somewhere behind the banality of the moment, a memory arrived with the taste of metal in her mouth. A man in a store, a voice that treated her as if she were invisible, a slow erosion of dignity. She had answered then with a legal calm, but the memory left a residue. Now, with officers leaning in, the residue spread. The smaller officer stepped back and reached toward his pocket. Evelyn, in the same breath, realized he was pulling out a phone. Her stomach dropped. He held it up like a child showing a prize. The screen showed a small video he had been recording. On it, a young man had once been arrogant enough to speak a sentence she remembered. Today, it would be a clip. Evelyn felt the heat of being pictured without permission. The world, loved as spectacle, what had been private suddenly belonged to everyone. "Smile for the camera," the large officer said. The laugh that followed tried to convert discomfort into entertainment. Evelyn felt something split inside her, a thin crack that ran down her spine. It was a quiet fracture that would make strange sounds later, like a long pipe after a snowfall. She did something she rarely did in moments of provocation. She put her phone on record, hidden at her side, the screen dark. She had learned in the law that evidence sometimes arrived in small, steady ways. Better to have a straight line of what happened than a memory that could be trimmed and shaped. Her hand shook, just enough for the motion to feel human. In the background, a bus hissed and a woman with a baby stepped off the curb. A man in a suit glanced over and looked away when he saw Evelyn standing with officers. The world watched, then folded back into its chores. The officers laughed again, louder, and the smaller one, by instinct or malice, made a crude joke. The words landed like a punch. When they finally let her go, it was with an almost gallant shrug, like men permitting a woman to return to her less important path. Evelyn walked away with her heart striking hard against her ribs. People looked. A child tugged her mother's sleeve and asked what had happened. Evelyn kept walking, each step a small act of resistance. Her phone in her pocket held a quiet, pulsing file that felt like a living thing. At home, she sat on the edge of her couch and pressed play. The recording was clear enough. Voices, a few laughs, the officer's light cruelty. Her own voice was there, steady and calm and small, a different kind of evidence than the one the officers thought they were creating. On the video, she watched herself stand, hands folded, and be reduced to a punchline. The image of herself on the screen held a multitude of textures. The tired crease at her temple, the faint scar near her jaw she liked to forget, the way she held herself like a person who had learned to take up only certain amounts of space. She thought of Daniel and the photograph she had tucked away. She thought of Sarah's text, "Watch the news this morning." She thought, too, of the clerk Mark saying safe trip home. The city had been making a slow ledger of small kindnesses and slights against her life. Now someone would add another line. By afternoon, the clip had leaked. It arrived in her inbox from a number she did not recognize and then from an old friend. It was on a feed, captioned with a dismissive joke. People had already started to comment, and their comments did not care about nuance. The officer's laughter looped like a cruel refrain. The clip that had felt private in the moment now began to rearrange the city's air around her, as if it were a weather pattern that would not be stopped. The narrator watched Evelyn then with two voices, one that felt every bruise and a second that cataloged details. The angle of the camera, the officer's boot polish, the small inconsistency in their uniforms that might later matter. Both voices saw the same thing. The world had shifted. There was, beneath the clip, a second movement that even Evelyn could not yet name. The officers did not realize the full weight of what they had done, but someone else did. They had given something volatile to a public that loved quick judgments and trite outrage. Somewhere a choice had been made to publish, to share, to sting. That choice would have a maker with a motive. Evelyn felt, without knowing why, that the coming days would ask her not only to claim her dignity, but to reckon with who had turned her private humiliation into a public weapon. Later, as she sat with the video dark under her fingers, a thought arrived like a cold wind. Betrayal does not always come with a shout. Sometimes it comes quietly, a video uploaded, a name whispered, a friend who does not reply. She felt, for the first time since the courtroom lamp had gone out, the pressure of an earthquake beginning far beneath the streets. The morning the clip went viral, Evelyn felt the room tilt under her like a ship caught in a sudden swell. Her phone would not stop buzzing. Each notification sounded like a small hammer. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, and two voices. One that wanted to comfort her, one that took notes, narrated the scene in her head. The tender voice named her wounds. The impartial voice cataloged the facts, time stamps, camera angles, the officer's badge numbers. Both voices were right. Sarah arrived first, breathless from the bus, and with a face that did not know how to steady itself for bad news. She hugged Evelyn as if by force of will she could press the storm flat. "I saw it," she said, voice thin. "I'm so sorry." Her eyes were wet, not only for Evelyn, but for what the clip promised the city, a story people could chew on and forget. Evelyn let the hug hold her for a second, then stepped back. "Thank you," she said. "Sit." Her voice was the same that people trusted in court, but now it felt like it belonged to someone else. Sarah sat across and took Evelyn's hands in hers, small and sure. "Do you want me to handle anything? Call the press? Lawyer up?" she asked, the questions falling fast like pebbles. "No," Evelyn said after breath. "Not yet." Her restraint was a kind of armor. She had spent a life measuring when to strike, when to wait. "We need to know who uploaded it." The words were practical, but underneath them lay an ache that made her chest tight. Why had anyone thought it was funny? Why did the city need another joke, with her, as the punchline? They spoke then of small things that were not small. The clerk Mark, who had nodded when she left the courthouse, Daniel's photograph tucked in a drawer. The way people's faces shifted when they saw the video. "People will assume," Sarah said. "They'll make their own stories. They'll fill in the gaps." She tapped the table, impatient. "Whatever we do, we control what we can." Evelyn thought of control as an imperfect tool. In law, control is a promise you give to the facts. Chain them, line them up, present them. In life, control often meant keeping a small safe place inside your chest where grief and anger could not trample everything else. She had kept such a place for Daniel. She had kept one for the dignity of her office. Now, both felt more fragile. Outside, the city moved with its indifferent energy. Officers Paul and Jason, their names now attached to the clip by the first reporters, were suddenly public figures in the smallest, meanest way. Evelyn did not know them beyond what the recording allowed. She imagined them with lives that included good things. A child's drawing on a refrigerator, a callous palm from work, a joke that made a partner laugh. The human mind wants to make villains neat. She resisted that urge. Villains are often people with small breaks in them that other people exploit. Her friend Mark called in mid-morning. His voice on the phone was bright but frightened. "There's talk in court. People are taking sides already." He sounded as if he had been trying to push back, an incoming tide and failing. "Some say we should handle it quietly. Others think it will blow over." The indecision in his voice laid out a map of the courthouse's politics. Caution, expediency, fear of scandal. Evelyn felt the tug between duty and self-protection. As a judge, she had to be the scale that did not tip. As a woman, she felt the old hunger for someone to reach across and say, "I believe you." The conflict inside her was neither simple nor pretty. In the quiet of her apartment, she wrestled with a question that had no right answer. Was it better to claim the story loudly and risk being seen as petty, or to handle it quietly and risk its dangerous erosion? At noon, the county prosecutor, a man named Thomas, requested a meeting. Thomas had always been professional, his hands precise, when he spoke. Yet today his greeting had an awkwardness under it, like a man trying to measure a step that might be too far. "Judge Carter," he said, "we should coordinate." He talked about procedure, about internal reviews and departmental accountability. His language was careful. Evelyn listened. "You're asking me to trust a system that failed me," she said quietly. It was not a challenge so much as an observation. Thomas's face folded into an expression that read as sympathy and strategy at once. "We will get to the bottom of it," he promised. Evelyn wanted to believe him. Part of her wanted to watch him closely enough to note each small tremor as it happened. The first twist arrived not in court, but in a private email. A local blogger, loud, hungry, and fond of drama, sent Evelyn a message claiming the uploader had ties to a city councilman. The claim was thin, a thread of rumor with the kind of sparkle that makes readers click. Evelyn read it twice, then 3 times, feeling the hair on her arms rise. Someone had a motive to make trouble, perhaps a political rival, perhaps someone with an old grudge. The possibilities multiplied like shadows when you light them from the wrong angle. That night, Sarah sat on her couch and spoke plainly. "You need witnesses," she said. "You need more than your word against theirs." Evelyn thought of the recording in her pocket, the cold proof of what had happened. But proof is not the same as trust. Proof must be placed in a legal container to have power. She thought of the courtroom where decisions live and breathe, and the people who fill those seats with questions and doubts. Then came a second, subtler twist. A reporter from a national outlet called and asked if Evelyn would do an interview about the clip. His voice was smooth and offered the kind of platform that could amplify her voice beyond the petty meanness of local feeds. Sarah wanted her to take it. Thomas advised caution. Evelyn felt the weight of possible outcomes. A national spotlight could protect her with public sympathy, but it could also expose her to more venom. She considered Daniel's photograph and the kind of privacy that felt like safety. At the heart of Act 2, relationships began to show their unstitched edges. Sarah, who in law school had been the one to stay up late proofreading briefs and pouring coffee, feared losing her friend to public opinion. She tried to be both counselor and armorer, sometimes failing at both. Thomas, the prosecutor, oscillated between a dutiful ally and a man mindful of his career's steadiness. Mark, the clerk, offered practical support, but also confided in Evelyn about the courthouse's politics, whispers of promotions hinging on public image. Each person had a stake that bent their choices. Evelyn herself vacillated between the judge's cool reasoning and the woman who wanted to scream. In private, she would trace the lines on Daniel's photograph with a fingertip, feeling both the warmth of memory and the sting of betrayal at how easily the city could turn a life into a spectacle. She thought often of the officers not as cardboard villains, but as agents in a system that allowed small cruelties. In that thought lay a question that would become central. Who benefits when dignity is stripped away? The narrator, tender and objective in turn, watched Evelyn's city rearrange itself. There were small betrayals already. A colleague who failed to return a call, a friend who flinched in the wrong place, a message thread left unread. Each acted like a line of weakness in a dam, and Evelyn felt water pushing at the seams. The scene ended with her standing at her window, looking out over the city lights. She held her phone like a small, strange compass. Below, everything glittered and moved, as if nothing had happened. Inside, everything had shifted. A packet arrived on a rainy Thursday like a flat stone dropped into a pond, small, unassuming, and sending rings outward. It sat on Evelyn's kitchen table when she came in from court, a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a printout, a single sheet that smelled faintly of printer ink and someone else's caution. The top line was technical and unreadable to anyone but a careful eye. It was a server log, a digital footprint of an upload. Under it, someone had circled a line with a shaky hand. Evelyn read it twice before the room stopped tilting. The upload had not come from a stranger's phone on the street. It had traced back to the courthouse's internal network. Someone inside had taken the clip, saved it, and then sent it out into the world. Her throat closed. The neat architecture of her life, work, small rituals, the private drawer with Daniel's photograph, seemed to tremble. Sarah came the moment Evelyn texted. Her face, always quick to show sympathy, went still as she skimmed the printout. "This is internal," she said, voice low. "It's from the court system." Her hand pressed against the table, as if to stop the quake. Evelyn watched her, trying to read the changes in a friend's expression like a judge looks for tells in a witness. The tenderness that had been Sarah's steadying force flickered with something like an alarm. "How would it get out?" Sarah asked. She sounded frightened for more than Evelyn. She sounded frightened for the courthouse's whole fragile dignity. Evelyn's mind ran a quick inventory of people who had access: clerks, assistants, IT staff, sometimes prosecutors who needed to pull files. There were people who moved through the building like ghosts, taking knowledge with them. Mark's name rose first because of proximity. He was the clerk who had smiled at her as she left the night of the rain, small kindness folded into routine. He was also the kind of man who knew the court's inner routes and secrets. Evelyn thought of his quiet voice on the phone earlier in the week, of the way he had hesitated before mentioning the courthouse politics. She did not want to believe it. She also did not want to be naive. When Evelyn went to the clerk's office, the smell of old paper and lemon cleaner wrapped around her like a shroud. Mark looked up from his desk with the same nervous politeness he always wore. His hands were damp, and his eyes avoided hers for a second longer than felt natural. "Judge Carter," he said, You had access to the network, Evelyn said quietly. She watched him instead of asking his name. The way she spoke had the calm edge of someone trained to hold a room. Did you upload the clip? Mark's shoulders drooped. His face unmade itself into something like a child who had been found with crumbs and a broken promise. He opened his mouth and then closed it. I didn't post it, he said at last, but I sent it. The confession landed in the room like a small stone. I handed it to someone who asked. Who asked? Evelyn pushed, and the clerk's small shame turned into something else, fear, with its bright, insistent eyes. He swallowed. Thomas called, he said, for a favor. He said it would help the investigation. He said to pull the footage and send it. I thought he meant for internal review. Hearing Thomas's name made Evelyn's gut tighten in a way that felt rotten with irony. Thomas, the prosecutor who had offered cautious counsel and careful language, who had come to her with promises of internal review, was now the name on someone else's lips. The neat line between ally and adversary blurred. You're saying Thomas asked you to get this? Evelyn said. Her voice was steady, but small shards of anger threaded it. Mark's eyes were wet now. He said it would show misconduct, that it would help make a case. He said it needed to be public, so the department would act. I trusted him. I thought it was right. Evelyn felt the burn of betrayal as a cold thing. Not only had someone inside the courthouse let the clip loose, but the person who advocated for process, who had sat across a table and promised accountability, might be the one who had weaponized the system. The idea turned her stomach. She found Thomas in his office under the courthouse's sparse light, moving papers as if each sheet could rearrange a fact into something better. He looked up when she entered, the same polite composure in his face. Judge, he said, but his voice trembled just enough to expose him. You asked Mark to pull the file and send it out, Evelyn said without preamble. It was not an accusation, it was an attempt to hold him with something precise. Thomas's hands rested on his desk like a man trying to steady a ship. I asked for the file, he admitted, but I didn't post it. He sounded like someone admitting to a small sin and hoping the confession would shorten the list. I was trying to force an internal inquiry. The department drags its feet. This was the only way to make the move. His eyes were earnest. Judge, I thought it would protect you. The narrator's two voices split their observation. Then, the tender voice that wanted to believe in good intentions and the impartial voice that recorded precise damage. Evelyn listened and felt both. Thomas's defense had the ring of truth and the scent of convenience. He had stepped beyond protocol and into publicity, and now he wanted to spin his trespass into defense. You made a choice to weaponize my image, Evelyn said quietly. Whether or not you posted it, you released something private into the public that chews up people for sport. Thomas's face crumpled. I wanted the department to act, he said. They ignore internal complaints unless something loud happens. I thought if it got attention, they'd take it seriously. I didn't think of how it would feel for you. I thought we were on the same side. Evelyn felt a hollowing inside her that had nothing to do with the courthouse. It was the particular ache of realizing that people you trusted could see your dignity as an instrument. Mark had been caught between a promise and a ladder. Thomas had made a choice that he framed as noble. Both had failed her. The betrayal forced new questions. If Thomas had the motive to expose her for the greater good, who else might he be protecting? The blogger's hint at a councilman had not seemed concrete. Now the twist rearranged into a more dangerous map. Thomas might be working for justice or for political theater. Mark had been the courier between trust and consequence, and his fear suggested more hands in the chain. Evelyn left the office with the taste of rust in her mouth. The city outside moved on oblivious. The domestic radio in her kitchen sang an old hymn she had heard since childhood. Its calmness felt like mockery. In the night, she sat with the server log spread on her lap and felt how small the paper was and how enormous its meaning. The people who had pledged to protect law and order had used the law's infrastructure to make her a spectacle. The twist had not only revealed who had opened the door, it had yanked the hinge from the wall. What had seemed like random cruelty now had hands behind it, hands that wore familiar rings and used familiar voices. Evelyn felt the world narrow and then widen into a long horizon of betrays and choices. The road forward would demand more from her than the measured patience of the bench. It would demand that she choose between exposing them and keeping the quiet dignity she had always held dear. As the rain began again, soft and unrelenting, the narrator held two views, one that named the wound and one that watched the stitches begin. Both agreed on this. Evelyn Carter had been betrayed from within, and the next steps would not be easy. Rain kept time with the city, a soft percussion that made everything smaller and more urgent. Evelyn could feel the pressure building like a storm locked behind glass. After Thomas's confession and Mark's trembling honesty, nothing felt stable. Her everyday life, the robe hung in her closet, the photograph in the drawer, the quiet rituals of a woman who trusted facts, now sat beside questions that would not be soothed by routine. The first external blow came from the courthouse itself. An internal review was opened, and with it came a flurry of requests and subpoenas. Staff were asked to hand over logs, cameras, and personal devices. The IT office became a small war room of pale faces and humming machines. Evelyn found the sight of technicians huddled over servers oddly intimate and terrifying. The courthouse, that steady pillar where she had counted on rules, now had its insides exposed like a patient on an operating table. People began to speak in halves. Colleagues offered cautious sympathy at first and then retreated when the cameras found them. A senior judge sent a formal email expressing concern and backing the process. In private, other judges whispered about propriety and danger. Evelyn could feel the tilt of their calculations. How would her response affect their seats? How would a scandal ripple through their reputations? The feeling was not betrayal so much as the cool arithmetic of institutions. It filled her with a loneliness that had the shape of a courtroom aisle. At home, packages started arriving. Some were supportive notes and cards from strangers who had seen the clip and felt something move in them. Others were anonymous, a printed article folded with a cruel headline, a note that said, "Funny, isn't it?" The mail felt like a jury that could be swayed by whispers. Evelyn learned to accept the good mail and to burn the hateful, because action demanded clarity and rancor made clarity harder. Sarah grew watchful in a way that was new to Evelyn. The friend who once laughed easily now checked locks, watched faces, and made plans. "We need a narrative," Sarah said one night, her voice raw with a tiredness Evelyn had not seen before. "Not just evidence. People react to stories more than to the truth. If we don't control the story, someone else will." The words were practical, but they carried an edge, the admission that truth alone might not be enough. Evelyn felt stretched between two roles. Part of her wanted the slow, sure march of legal remedy, subpoenas, internal discipline, a clear record of wrongdoing. Part of her, quieter and rawer, wanted to lash out and reclaim what had been taken. She imagined confronting the officers publicly, laying bare the small cruelty of their laughter and the way it had been broadcast. She imagined standing in a press room, her voice steady, naming the betrayal. But every imagined scene had costs. Humiliating colleagues, inflaming crowds, making the courthouse an arena. Late one night, after a day of interviews and subpoenas, a message came from an unknown number. It contained a photograph of Daniel's face, taken from the old kitchen picture, cropped tight, so only his smile showed. The message had no words. Evelyn sat frozen as the air in the apartment seemed to thicken. Daniel's smile had been a quiet sanctuary, now it felt like a target. The thought that someone was watching her past, watching her private grief, pulled a new kind of fear through her, a sense that the betrayal was not only professional but personal. The media pressure increased with a rhythm that felt relentless. Local outlets wanted updates, national reporters wanted interviews. Every request pushed Evelyn onto a tighter wire. Thomas urged measured replies. Sarah urged action. Mark pleaded in little texts for guidance, confessing his shame and offering what he could. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he wrote. "I only wanted them to look." His words were both balm and burden. A deeper fracture grew between Evelyn and Thomas. At first, she had believed his explanation that he had wanted to force accountability. But as more details surfaced, a shadowy email thread, a councilman's aide who called about public posture, an unnamed source saying the disclosure might hurt the judge just enough to humble her, the edges of Thomas's motives looked less clean. Evelyn began to suspect that Thomas's idea of justice included a politics she had not agreed to. When she confronted him, he did not deny contact with political aides. Instead, he spoke about the urgency of public will. Sometimes the system needs a shove, he said. We use the push for a purpose. Whose purpose, Thomas? Evelyn asked, and there was no warmth in the question. She watched him assemble his answer carefully, like a man adjusting the angles of a photograph so the light looks right. The distance between them widened. He still offered help, but the help carried weight. It came with conditions he never explicitly named. Evelyn could feel herself being asked to trade parts of her privacy and dignity for a chance at institutional remedy. The thought made her chest ache. At the courthouse, not everyone stayed neutral. An aide to a city councilman started asking questions at staff meetings, fingers tracing at policy that could be used for leverage. The blogger who first hinted at political ties now posted an anonymous tip tying the officers to a municipal audit fight. Rumors multiplied and clung to the case like burrs. Inside Evelyn, choices multiplied and threatened to choke her. Should she demand an internal investigation and risk the courthouse's wrath? Should she go public with the full sequence of events and expose Thomas and the clerk, piling scandal onto scandal? Should she step back, allow the legal process to work slowly, and trust that truth would win? Each path had costs: reputation, privacy, the careers of people she had once respected. The narrator observed her with both mercy and clinical clarity. The merciful voice wanted her to remember how small acts of tenderness had kept her going. Sarah's hugs, Mark's loyalty, in other matters, Daniel's photograph tucked away like a soft secret. The clinical voice counted the consequences: leaked information, political interference, growing public appetite for spectacle. Both voices agreed that Evelyn had little time before the public narrative hardened into something that might not be true. The night before a major hearing, Evelyn sat alone and made a list. Not rules exactly, but touchstones. Tell the truth. Protect those who had acted out of fear, not malice. Expose manipulations. Keep her voice measured. The simple list steadied her like a rope. She slept poorly, but enough to set her feet under her tomorrow. On the morning of the hearing, a storm rolled in, heavy and gray. It matched the mood in the courthouse, waiting electric. The hallway buzzed with whispered theories and camera lenses like eyes. Evelyn felt the whole building watching. She straightened her robe, not because it would change facts, but because it reminded her who she had sworn to be. The choices she had deferred until now would sharpen like a blade in the hearing room. She would have to pick which truth to place first on the table: the human, tender truth of personal violation or the institutional truth that might set a precedent. Outside, a single siren rose and fell. Inside, her heart beat steady and loud. The decision she would make in the next hours would not only affect the officers and the clerk and the prosecutor, it would touch the small, private parts of her life she had kept confidential. The stakes now felt personal and public at once, braided tight like two ropes that would hold or break. The hearing room smelled of paper and rain and something like old decisions. Lamps threw pools of light onto the long oak table. Cameras blinked from the back like insects. People sat with folded hands and sharp faces. Evelyn stood at the center of it all, her robe heavy as a promise. Her heart was a steady drum, not because she had no fear, but because she had chosen this moment like someone who chooses to step into a storm with eyes open. Two voices watched her, one soft and knowing the small hurts, the other precise and patient like a scale. The soft voice remembered Daniel's laugh and the way his hand fit into hers. It felt the sharpness of being shown to the world as a joke. The precise voice counted the logs and timestamps and how small evidence can topple larger lies. Both voices agreed. This room would end what had been loose and begin what would be rebuilt. Thomas sat to one side, hands folded, a man whose face tried to be contrite and clever at once. Mark sat nearer the edge, shoulders hunched, eyes red at the rims from nights he did not sleep. The officers, Paul and Jason, sat together, uniforms ironed, faces fixed under the weight of public shame. A councilman's aide lingered in the back with a neutral face that read like a closed book. The blogger who had first fanned the clip's flames was there too, a thin smile trying to look like justice had been served simply by being loud. Evelyn began not with accusation, but with a fact. Her voice, when she spoke, was the voice that had always carried verdicts, steady, clear, without flourish. This series of events began on public ground and moved through private channels, she said. We will place the facts in front of the room. She played the courthouse server log on the screen. The room watched numbers and times like a prayer. The precise narrator pointed to details. An IP address, an access time, a username. The soft narrator watched Mark's fingers curl and then unclench. The logs were simple. They did not argue. They told a path from the clerk station to Thomas's workstation, then out into the public stream. The air in the room shifted as if someone had opened a heavy curtain. Thomas rose and reached for a diplomacy he had practiced. I asked for the file, he said, his voice thin. I wanted transparency. We needed an investigation. He spoke like a man who believed his own rationales, which is to say he was both honest and dangerous. Evelyn let him speak. She had learned that people reveal themselves by how much they need to be heard. Then she played a second thing, an email thread. The messages were plain. Thomas had written to a contact in the councilman's office asking for pressure and suggesting the clip be made public to speed action. The contact's reply hinted at a darker choreography, a plan not simply for accountability, but for a public moment that would shift power. The impartial voice observed that motive had teeth. The tender voice felt the betrayal as if someone had cut a ribbon that held a whole garment together. Mark's head dropped. His confession came out like a small ragged thing. He told me it would help, he said, voice hollow. He said it was the only way to make them care. I thought we were doing the right thing. The room heard the crack in a man who had chosen loyalty over principle, who had confused pressure for justice. The blogger smiled then, a small triumph flashing. So, a story of justice, he said, brought to light. His tone assumed victory. Evelyn's reply was not aimed at him so much as at the room itself. She cupped the photograph of Daniel from her drawer and set it on the table like a small altar. Justice is not a thing to be manufactured, she said. It is not a performance. You cannot call it by humiliating a person. This was the moment when the second twist arrived, quieter but harder. Evelyn had not only the server logs and the emails. She had the original unedited video she had recorded on her phone that day, the tiny file she had kept like a pulse. She played it, the officer's words, the laugh, the moment a badge angle changed to capture her face, the smaller officer passing the phone to his partner. Then, under the video, she showed another clip pulled from the council aide's phone, a conversation in which the aide suggested the clip be timed to political news to maximize shame. The aide's voice, smug and small, mentioned a name, Daniel, and a rumor that Daniel had once crossed the councilman in a contract fight. The room held a single long breath. The implication hit like cold water. Daniel was not only a memory, he had been collateral in a political current. The tender narrator felt a fresh sorrow, as if someone had taken the softness she had kept for Daniel and flung it into the street. The impartial voice logged connections. A councilman's motive, a prosecutor's convenience, a clerk's fear. The betrayal was not merely a single misstep. It was a map of people who used private pain to play a public game. Thomas's face changed. For a beat, he looked as if he might fall into pieces. He tried to argue necessity, to speak of institutional inertia and the need for outrage to spark action. Evelyn listened and then asked the question that gathered everything into a single point. When did justice become the same as weaponry, she asked. When did you decide that my dignity was collateral in your strategy? Silence answered her, which is sometimes the loudest sound in a room. The judge, overseeing the hearing, a steady, cool figure, watched the evidence with the careful face of someone deciding more than law. Cameras recorded the edges of things that would later be replayed and argued. People shifted in their seats. Then, the final unraveling. The officers caught in the raw clip had laughed and joked in a way that showed ignorance and cruelty. But their behavior was not isolated. A whisper came from a uniformed officer in the back. Paul, the larger man, had a side conversation recorded earlier where he braggadociously referenced receiving texts from a counsel aide praising the publicity. That small testimony tied the officers to the political chain. It made the map complete, from courthouse logs to prosecutorial intent to political hands that would use a private moment for leverage. The room felt like a body exhaling after holding its breath too long. Thomas stood and offered apologies that sounded thin next to the damage. The counsel aide was called forward. His face blanched when the conversation recording was played. Mark's eyes flitted between faces, as if trying to find the one person who might forgive him. Evelyn did not celebrate. Her victory was not a joy. It was a settling of a score she had not wished to keep. The impartial voice noted the consequences. Thomas's suspension, inquiries into the counsel office, an internal affairs probe into the officers. The tender voice cataloged grief, the public pain, the invasion of a private photograph, the way trust had been used as a ladder. When the hearing closed, the rain had stopped and the city's lights hummed wet and aware. People filed past the courthouse steps with their own small dramas, unaware or indifferent. Evelyn walked down the steps slowly. The night air had the clean, hard smell after rain. Her robe felt less heavy, as if some weight had been shifted. She had exposed the web. She had named the hands. Justice, crude and late, began to move. At home, she opened the drawer, took out Daniel's photograph, and set it on the table like a promise renewed. The two narrators softened together. The impartial voice acknowledged the legal victories, the probes, the suspended careers, the beginning of accountability. The tender voice held quieter things. The way it felt to reclaim a name from the noisome public, the small comfort of rituals, the difficulty of trust rebuilt slowly. Evelyn thought of what she would teach her courtroom after this. That dignity matters, that procedure must not be used as a bludgeon, that truth requires care. She understood, too, that some wounds do not close neatly. The betrayals had unspooled a map of how power flows and how private sorrow can be turned into political currency. The moral was not tidy. It was a quiet, hard lesson. When people decide the ends justify their means, they damage not only their targets, but the very fabric of justice. She sat with the photograph and the quiet, and for the first time in weeks allowed herself a small, honest breath. The city continued to move outside, lights spilling into puddles. Evelyn held the photograph like a soft thing and felt both the cost and the clarity of the day. The world had shown its edges, she had shown hers, that she thought might be enough to begin again. The weeks that followed moved like slow weather. The probes and suspensions unfolded in careful legal language, each headline a measured tally of consequence. Thomas suspended pending inquiry, the counsel aide under review, officers placed on leave. The blogger's readership churned through takeaways and made new targets, hungry for the next outrage. But the real work was quieter and harder, the work of putting pieces back together where they had been broken. Evelyn found herself in rooms she used to enter with certainty and now entered with a different kind of purpose. She met with internal affairs and with reform committees. She accepted invitations to speak to young clerks and law students about dignity and procedure. When she spoke, she did not shout about the betrayal. She said instead that the law is fragile when people treat it like a tool instead of a trust. Her voice was the same one that had moved verdicts, but now it carried a softer grain. She told them about small things, how evidence must be protected, how a person's name is not a pawn, how the rush for action must not become an excuse for cruelty. People listened with faces that were not exactly repentant, but open enough to hear. Mark came to her office more than once, hands rough with worry, hair thinner than before. He apologized in the small way people do, not with great speeches, but with repeated acts of contrition. He returned files he had copied, he volunteered to spearhead a new privacy protocol at the courthouse, and he stayed late, fixing holes his ignorance had let open. Evelyn watched him do the slow, steady work of making amends. It did not erase what had been done, but it began to stitch something new. Thomas's fall was not total, but it was sharp. He defended what he had done as a necessary jolt, arguing in public forums that sometimes institutions sleep and need a slap to wake. That argument found ears. Some praised him for forcing accountability. Others, hearing Evelyn's account, recoiled at the cost. He lost a promotion he had been close to, and his office was forever shadowed by the memory of a choice that had turned private pain into public spectacle. He came to Evelyn once, shoulders bent by consequence, and asked for a kind of forgiveness. She gave him what she could. Not absolution, but a stern recognition that some wrongs can be corrected only by changing how you work in the world. Paul and Jason faced their own reckonings. They received training, community service, and public rebukes. The public apology they offered felt thin in Evelyn's mouth, but she accepted it because the work of justice is not always satisfied by a single clean moment. It requires repair. It requires people to look at their hands and see the marks they left in promise, in actions, not only words, to change. The thing that weighed on Evelyn the most was not the punishment meted out, but the quiet erosion trust had suffered. She had always thought law was a kind of sanctuary, a place where facts had a fair hearing. The way people had used their positions to make a spectacle proved that sanctuaries could be turned into stages. She wrestled with a difficult moral question. When the system meant to protect dignity is itself a machine that can produce humiliation, how do you keep faith with the institution without becoming blind to its faults? One evening she sat alone at her kitchen table, Daniel's photograph open before her like a small, holy thing. The city hummed beyond the glass. She held the photo in her hands and thought of how easily a private memory had been dragged into public fight. She thought of Daniel's laugh, the way his shoulder had fit hers, the small kindnesses that do not make the news. She felt a sadness that was not only personal but civic. The cost of attention is often paid by people who did nothing to deserve it. She began writing, slowly, not a public op-ed for spectacle, but a short letter to the young clerks and interns who would follow. She wrote about dignity and procedure, about the temptation to treat people as instruments, about the quiet courage of small resistances. She closed the letter with a line she had come back to in her head. Do not let urgency become permission to harm. The letter did not undo anything, but it circulated in the courthouse and beyond in ways she had not expected. A few younger clerks printed it and gave it out. A law student quoted a line at a seminar. The reach was small and honest, and that made it matter in a different way. Her personal life felt more cautious. She kept Daniel's photograph on a shelf where morning light could touch it, and she allowed herself to speak of him in small gatherings. Friends who had been distant came back in careful ways. Sarah remained at her side, unwavering, practical, sometimes fierce. Their friendship was not the same as it had been. Trust had to be rebuilt there too, but they talked late into the night, learning each other's rhythms again. There were legal reforms too. The courthouse installed stricter protocols for access to internal networks and more transparent oversight for how evidence could be used. Training included not only technical safeguards but ethical ones, reminders that someone's personal life is not collateral. Evelyn sat on a panel that drafted language for protection and consent, arguing that public servants have a particular duty to preserve the dignity of those they encounter. She spoke about her own failure to use the badge of authority she carried when she might have quelled the moment earlier. She admitted the complexity of pride and privacy. The honesty of her confession gave weight to the reforms. At night, when the city quieted, she sometimes imagined the officers in the far future teaching their children different lessons than the ones they had learned. She imagined Mark watching the sunrise and thinking of ways to fix what had been broken. She did not know whether everyone would change or whether the world would keep finding new ways to trade privacy for clout. The possibility of relapse, of systems that bend to expediency, made her resolve firmer. Her oath to the law had always sounded like words written on a courthouse wall. Now it felt like a living thing she had to tend. Months later, on a morning when the sky was clean and white, Evelyn walked the steps of the courthouse and paused to look at the street below. The lampposts cast long shadows, and a bus hissed past. People moved with the regular, small dramas of life. She felt, in her chest, a tiredness and a clarity that lived together. The betrayal had cut her, but it had also shown her the limits of institutions and the need for personal courage inside them. She kept the photograph of Daniel in a drawer of small things that mattered. Now, when she opened it, she did not only remember loss. She remembered the way the city had rallied in small ways, the clerks who stood up, the reforms that began because one person refused to be reduced to a punchline. She understood, at last, that justice is not only a verdict or a punishment. It is the slow, stubborn work of holding people to higher standards, of making sure that when the law is used, it is used to heal, not to harm. Evelyn walked into the courthouse that morning with a steadier step. Her robe felt like an instrument that could do good if wielded with care. She had not found closure in the way novels promise. There were still loose threads, and the city would no doubt find other wounds. But she had found in the long aftermath a way to keep living by her principles. The moral she carried was not simple. It was a mixture of caution and hope. She would keep asking the hard questions, insisting that dignity be more than a buzzword and that justice be more than a spectacle. In that insistence, she found, oddly, a kind of peace. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you'll enjoy. Have a great day.